In this lesson, you will learn to calculate the total when you know the percent and the part by comparing them to fractions or ratios. Our goal is to apply previous understandings of fractions to finding percents of numbers. So how do we find the percent of a number? Well, there's a few things that we need to review. We know that percent, of course, we know that vocabulary word from previous tutorials. And whenever we have that of, that's a good hint that we might have a multiplication problem. So let's review. We know a percent is a ratio whose denominator is 100. So 60% is 60 over 100, which can of course be reduced to 3/5. You can write a percent as a ratio over 100. So let's review. Some common mistakes misrepresenting place value. So we have things like 1/10 of a percent is not 1% or 1 over 100. So make sure that, of course, you would rewrite that as 1,000, because 0.1 over 100, of course, can be transferred into 1,000th. Another common mistake is thinking that a ratio describes only one set of numbers. We know that 25% is commonly known as 1/4. Well, 1 out of 4 t-shirts would be 1 out of 4 total, but it can also be 2 out of 8. It can also be 25 out of 100. There are many different ways of representing fractions, and likewise, many different ways of writing percents. Let's look at an example. A Major League team carries 12 pitchers. 25% of the team pitchers are left-handed. How many pitchers are left-handed? So a few steps that we always want to know is, what is it asking us? It wants us to know how many pitchers are left-handed. It also tells us the total. We know that there are 12 pitchers, and we know that 25% of the pitchers of the 12 are left-handed. So we need to figure out 12 pitchers, 25% of 12. How can we write that? 25% of 12. And that is going to tell us how many are left-handed. Be careful with problems like this, because sometimes they'll ask you how many are right-handed, and we'll get into that later, but always double check to make sure your question matches the information you're given. So if I find 25% of 12, I'm going to use a ratio. Well, we know 25% means 25 over 100, which can be reduced into 1/4. The word of in this case, and of when dealing with percents, usually means to multiply. 12, of course, is my total. So I need to find my total number of left-handed pitchers. 1/4 of 12 is the same as 1/4 times 12 over 1. We can use cross products to figure out that 3 of the 12 are left-handed. And wouldn't you know that 3 out of 12 is the same as 1 out of 4? So of course you could have also used cross products to figure this out as well. But in this case, multiplying the fraction by the whole number is one of the most convenient ways of solving this. And again, checking our part to total can help us compare the percent to the fractions. So let's look at another example. Let's look at this example. Is 80% of 80% of 125 the same as 64% of 125? And explain. So we have to look at this in a few ways. I gave you this problem because oftentimes I would be working in retail, back when I worked in retail, and people would come in with coupons for an extra 15% off, something that was already marked 20% off, and they would often just add the percentages together. So I want to ask you, are those customers right? If I add the percentage, am I going to get the same discount? Well, let's see. Because 80 plus 80 is 160, not 64%. Let's look at this and break it down. So first step, let's look at this as multiplication. So we have two problems. The first one is 80% of 80% of 125. So we have 80% times 80% times 125. For the second one, we have 64% of 125. This is a problem where looking at it as fractions is a little bit easier than looking at it as decimals, I think. So let's think of 80%. 80 over 100 is 80%. Can we reduce that? Yes, we can. We can reduce it to 8/10, and then hopefully you notice that 8/10 can also be reduced to 4/5. So we have 4/5 times 4/5 times 125, and I'll just make that 125 over 1. I'm not going to solve this yet, because now I want to look at 64%, which is 64 over 100. I know that I can divide 64 and 100 both by 4 and get 16 over 25 of 125. And we'll make that one 125 over 1. Now let's analyze what we have. Let's first multiply our two fractions. And remember, when we multiply fractions, we can just multiply the tops and multiply the bottoms. So this one can be 4 times 4, which is 16, and 5 times 5, which is 25, times 125. And without solving it even, what do you notice? Well, we can see that 16/25 is the same as 4/5 times 4/5, or 80% of 80%. So in these cases, they are the same. So many adults would always get this wrong, I would say, while they were shopping, because many adults would just add the percentages. And now you can say that you're smarter than a lot of adults who go shopping, because 80% of 80% is 64%, not 160%. And we can analyze this by saying, for many reasons, you can say 80% times 80% is the same as 64%, or you can solve both of these. And of course, when you cross cancel, you would get, they both equal 80. But even in this case, this is one of those problems that you could even solve it without actually having to do that last step and do the math. So I hope that helps you, and we'll get into more problems like this later on. Now let's look at our final example, tennis. In 2013, 8 of the top 100 men's tennis players were from the United States. What percent were not from the United States? Here's a key word that says not. So now we have to think about, what do we know? Well, we know 8 out of 100 were from the United States. Hopefully you can associate 8/100ths with 8%. Well, I know that my percent needs to total 100 because I can't have more than 100% of a total population. There's people there. So if 8 out of 100 were from the United States, how many were not? Well, I can look at this as I have 100% total. I know that 8% plus some number is going to give me 100%. And hopefully you know your algebra and you can use reversibility to subtract 100% minus 8%, which means that 92% were not from the United States. So always be careful with that not. Whenever it asks you how many were or were not, you always have to subtract your percentages. Usually you're going to be subtracting from 100%. So always keep that in the back of your mind. Look at the question very carefully. Now it's your turn. You're going to find 60% of 75, find 30% of 90, and in the last problem it says 11 states refund money for the return of bottles. What percent of the 50 states do not refund money for returning bottles? Go ahead and take a minute to pause the tutorial, and I want you to think of these percents as ratios or as fractions. That'll help you with solving these problems. Go ahead and take a minute to pause now. In this lesson, you have learned how to find the percent of a number by looking at percents as ratios, in other words, comparing them as fractions. In the next coming up tutorials, we're going to look at percents in a variety of ways, fractions and decimals. Another great job today, and keep up the good work. I hope you see how ratios can really be useful to you.